Amen. That's pretty good, isn't it? So, do you see how when followers of Jesus Christ come into a city and they plant a garden and they help people grow their own food, people who really don't have enough food, how the hope of Jesus Christ, the hope of God is spread, and the kingdom of God is spread in a city through God's people, doing something as practical and simple as an urban garden or an urban farm. So we're going to be talking about those kinds of ideas today. If you're here last week or the week before that, you know we started a series about our city. And today I want to talk about how God has hope for this city, and I want to talk about Nineveh as a city of hope. And if you know much about Nineveh, you have to be thinking, well, how can Nineveh be a city of hope? If you don't know much about Nineveh, Nineveh is located in what would be modern-day Mosul in Iraq, and it sits on the edge of the Tigris River, and it's in the desert. But at the time when Jonah was there, when Jonah was sent there, it was considered the largest city in the world. It took, you read in the book of Jonah, it took him 3 days to walk through this city. It was the capital of Assyria. The problem is the Assyrians were at constant odds with the Israeli people, with the Hebrew people. They were fighting war after war. The Hebrew people did not like at all the Assyrians or the people of Nineveh. And so when God says to Jonah, go to the people of Nineveh because I want to redeem them, Jonah wants no part of it. He wants them cursed and destroyed. But God says, no, there's hope for the city. I just need to get you there to share my message. And so he's sent to Nineveh. Let's read what happened. So open your Bibles to where we read of this Old Testament city of Nineveh. Jonah, I'll start in chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preached against it, because it's wicked and has come before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarsus. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. With such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break apart. Verse 15. Then they took Jonah, the deckhands, and they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Chapter 2, verse 10, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. And then finally, so turn one more page in your Bible to chapter 3, verse 3, Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, this is the proclamation he issued. Let everyone call urgently on the Lord. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. And then verse 10, when God saw what they did and how they had turned from their evil ways, he had compassion and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. Well, this is a turnaround story, isn't it? First of all, when you hear this story, and we've heard this story in Sunday school for years when we're kids, you hear about this giant fish, some call it a whale, swallows Jonah because he's trying to run away from God. And kids sometimes in school are asked about this story. Have you heard that? For example, there's a true story of a 3rd grade kid. He's in class, and she's in class, and her teacher is teaching on whales and asked the kids, have any of you seen a whale? What do you know about whales? And one kid is waving, she's waving her hand wildly, and she says, I know a lot about whales. And the teacher says, what do you know? She says, well, in the Bible talks about a whale. And the whale swallowed a man named Jonah, and then after 3 days spit him out. And the teacher said, are you sure that's true? Because I think if a whale swallowed a person, they would surely die. And the teacher says, how do you know it's true? And the girl says, because it's in the Bible. And the teacher said, well, can you be certain the Bible is true? And she says, well, if you don't think it's true, I'll just ask Jonah when I get to heaven. And that will settle that, right? And the teacher said, well, what if Jonah's not in heaven? What if he's in that other place that place that's dark and hot and burning. Then the little girl said, then you can ask him. See? True story. You mess with kids, you're going to get burned, just like that. So we read of Jonah running away from Nineveh. Yes, the Hebrew people did not like the Ninevites at all. But also I brought pictures for you just to see where God had sent him. He sent him to Nineveh. Nineveh's in the middle of the desert, modern-day Mosul. Here's a picture here. So he's heading here. I looked at this picture and I thought, wow, it looks a lot like Globe, Arizona. So he's being sent to Globe. And he gets on a boat and he's heading to the south of Spain. That's where Tarsus is, and I brought a picture. So it's like Del Mar. So his choices are, God, do you want me to go to Del Mar or go to Globe, Arizona? It's an easy choice. You go to Del Mar. God, you can use me in Del Mar. And God says, no, I need you in Nineveh. And he sends him there, and he's resisting. But then we read, like I just read in chapter 3, of this great redemption story, the story of hope. And the king and the people of Nineveh hear the words of God that are spoken through Jonah, and it turns everything around. It turns the city around, it turns their lives around. So Nineveh had been on this trajectory heading down towards destruction. And maybe you see people's lives, individuals' lives, and they're heading on this path that it is only headed down. It's a path of destruction. In flying, if you know much about aviation, they call it a graveyard spiral. When a pilot is in a graveyard spiral, they don't even know it. They can't see it. There's this physical and psychological phenomenon where their equilibrium gets thrown off, and they don't trust their instruments anymore. It says you're descending rapidly, and they're going, that can't be true. I'm flying level. And they'll fly the plane right dead into the ground. And you probably know some people whose lives are on a graveyard spiral. And I want to say this morning that there's hope, that God has this redeeming message of hope that is delivered through people like Jonah and like you. When I think about people, and maybe you know people whose lives have been headed in a direction opposite of God. When I say that, I think of a young man who I met back in Chicago. I was a college pastor, but I also led a ministry to young adults called Crossroads. And this one guy shows up on a Tuesday night. It's his first time with us. And at the end of the night, he stays to talk to me. And as we're talking, he said, Palmer, you said tonight that God can forgive me for my sin and everything that I've done in my life. And I said, yes, it's true. That's what the Bible says. He says, but you don't understand, Palmer. He says, I don't think he can forgive me. And I'm saying, no, he really can. I'm trying to convince him of this. He said, Palmer, you don't understand. I've broken every single one of the 10 commandments. So I stepped back because I was like, that includes thou shalt not kill, doesn't it? I was like, I'm going to keep my distance. So no, we kept talking, and yes, in a way, he had broken even that one. And I said to him still, I said, no, yes, your life is on this trajectory down. But you see, our God is a God of hope, and he can pull you back up. And here's the thing that I knew, that when his life began to touch the lives of God's people in our ministry, it would start to change him. You see, there's only one person who God can use to change the life of a person whose life is spiraling into the ground. It's one of his people. It's you who's indwelt by the Spirit of God. When I say that, I think of a girl I write about from the Grove. I'll say her name is Ashley. And I knew Ashley and her family for years. And Veronica and I knew them well. And when she was in high school, she started to form addictions. First, it was alcohol. She would hide it under her bed. And then it grew to some drugs. And then her parents found out. So they switched schools, and then they put her in rehab, and then she's out, but then she forms another addiction, and they put her back in rehab, and this continued all through high school. And then she graduated. But she still wasn't free of any of her addictions. And I saw her on a Sunday morning in the Grove in our lobby. And I said to her, I said, Ashley, you need to go to Africa with me this summer. I said, I'm taking a bunch of college students. You need to come. And right away she says, I'm in. I'll get a ticket this week. And I said, good. And then some of our own staff, my own staff here, heard that she had signed up for our trip. And they said, Palmer, just so you know, I don't think she should be going with you. She has a lot of problems, and this isn't the right thing for her. I said, no, because she has problems, I want her to come. Because she has trouble, because her life is on this downward spiral, I want her to come and spend 2 weeks, 24 hours a day with people from the Grove, like you, with college students from the Grove and adults from the Grove. And for 2 weeks she came, and when her life started to touch those lives, they began to hear her story. And for 2 weeks she held orphan babies. At the end of 2 weeks, and the only thing I can say, the only way I can explain it is God himself. At the end of 2 weeks, she's a different person. She comes back and registers to go to a Christian college. She only stays there a semester because then she goes to study in Australia with a mission organization. And then they send her to South Africa and Eastern Europe. And she's in school and then serving and back in school and then serving for a semester. And it took her like 7 or 8 years to finish college. But the trajectory of her life changed dramatically when she came into contact with people like you. And that's my point here, is that God uses Jonah to go into this city to say there's hope. And you don't have to be on this path of destruction. There's 2 observations from this passage, from this short book of Jonah, that I want to share with you this morning. The first one is this, that we have a compassionate God. And he wants to redeem this city. He wants to redeem people and lives in this city. That's the kind of God that we have. We have this God who can turn lives around. He can turn marriages around. He can turn cities around. He can turn businesses around, but we have this turnaround story that comes from this God who's a compassionate God. So in chapter 3, I want to read verse 10 again. When God saw what they did and how they turned from their evil ways, this is the people of Nineveh, he had compassion on them and did not bring them to the destruction he had threatened. So we read about God's great compassion. Do you see why I say Nineveh is a great story of redemption and hope? It's a great turnaround story. I think sometimes in our own lives or in our friend's life or our family's life, we'll see that things need to turn around. So we'll say, God, can you change things a little bit? And I want to say this, God doesn't change things a little bit. He turns them all the way around. Sometimes we say, God, I need a little bit of help, just slight help. God doesn't just give slight help. He can turn things completely around. And I just want you to know this morning that there is nothing, no problem, no life, no city, no family, no marriage that God cannot turn around. And so you can put it in front of him. You can put your marriage in front of him. You can put your finances, you can put your business, you can put your career, and he can turn it around if that's what's needed. And so my first observation here this morning is that Nineveh is this great story of God redeeming a city. Nineveh, I said, is this story of hope. And the thing is, hope is as necessary to the human soul as the air that we breathe. If we don't have hope, we give up on life. And I hope you get God's story of hope, because that's what he wants you to take out into our neighborhoods and into our city. He wants you to tell people who are overwhelmed with life or feel betrayed by a spouse that there is hope, or feel like they're drowning in debt. He wants you to let them know that there is hope. So God is compassionate is the first thought that I want you to take home with you. And he wants to redeem this city and the lives of this city. And then the second observation I have from this passage is that God uses people like you, like he used Jonah. God uses individual people. You are part of God's plan for redeeming this city. Jonah, we read this, so let's go back to chapter 3, verse 3. We read, Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. So we read that Jonah obeyed and finally agrees to listen to God. And so God uses Jonah to go into this city and change everything. And so because of that, I want to make this statement this morning. It's a key idea. I want it to stick with you. And it's in your handout. It's this, that the church, this church, but the church means the gathering of God's people, but the church is the hope of the city. The church is the hope of this city. Now, just so you get it theologically correct, yes, Jesus Christ is the hope of the world, so let's not miss that. But here's the thing. God has always used his people, real, live, breathing people, to spread his kingdom and his message of hope. So in that sense, I believe it's logically correct to extrapolate that you, the church, is the hope of the city. So do you see how that works? And I believe that strongly. That's why I've given my life to helping to grow a local church, helping to grow the Grove. And I hope that if you come into this church and it hits you this morning that the church is the hope of the city, that you are no longer a casual attender here on Sundays, breezing in and breezing out. I hope you start to give your life to what this church is a part of, because the church, and by the way, church just means a gathering of God's people. You are the hope of the city. And so that's why I come back to God using Jonah, different water story. God uses Jonah to walk through this city, literally walk the streets of the city. Now, maybe your story has been Jonah's story. Maybe God hasn't been able to use you to redeem this city because your life is heading in the wrong direction. And so, of course, we know God sends this big fish to swallow Jonah. Let's read what happens next. He's in the belly of the whale for 3 days, and he's a broken man. So this is like solitary confinement in a real, wet, sloppy, smelly place. And he's all of a sudden, okay, God, I'll go to Globe in Miami, Arizona. And here's what we read. Chapter 2, verse 1. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. But you, Lord my God, verse 6, brought my life up from the pit. Great words. Turned everything around. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you in your holy temple. I say salvation comes from the Lord. And so maybe that's been you. Maybe you have been Jonah. Maybe you have never said, okay, God, here is my life. You can use it to redeem this city. And today, I hope you start thinking differently about God using your life. Jesus always talked about how you and me, his people, are the light of this city. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, we read, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. And when you think about Jesus' work, it didn't happen in a church building, or they had temples and synagogues. Sometimes he preached there, but his most effective ministry, the times when he changed society, he was at a wedding, or he was at a feast, or he was at a dinner or lunch with friends, or he was walking down the road having conversations with strangers, or he showed up at a well, kind of like a Circle K for a drink, and he's just talking to people. It happens in our ordinary, everyday lives that Jesus wants to use you to redeem this city. This is the essence. I hope you get this idea that God uses people, real live people like you and Jonah, to change cities. It's the impetus for us saying that we, the Grove, are a missional people, or we are a missional church. It doesn't mean, missional church doesn't mean that we only go to places far away like Thailand or Africa or Cuba or Haiti. But it means that we live on mission every day in the neighborhood that God puts you in. You live on, when you wake up tomorrow morning, you're on mission for God. In Peterson Farms, or in Spectrum, or in Creekwood Ranch, or Fulton Ranch, or Riggs Ranch, or Cooper Commons, or Seville, whatever neighborhood God puts you in, you live on mission there. That's where it starts. And God uses you to change families and to change marriages and to change people whose lives are spiraling in this downward trajectory, and he uses you to turn them around. So I've talked about this passage in Jonah. We've talked about Jonah's story. I want to use the rest of our time to share some very practical handles for you to grab onto. Some very tangible ways that you can be the hope of the city, okay? And some of these may be right in your sweet spot, or maybe it will trigger something, an area for you to get involved in. But so I just have a list of ordinary, everyday ways that God wants to use you. First, I'll say this. When you plant an urban garden, the church becomes the hope of the city. And we heard this in the story, the news story on Bonton, Dallas. I asked Josh, he's grown up in Dallas. I said, have you ever played in Bonton? He just laughed, like you don't come out of Bonton alive. And now there's Christians planting a garden there. And our vision and hope for this church is not that we just have a garden here. Maybe we have a garden on this part of our property, but also to build urban gardens in Chandler. And now Paul Gunther tells me that he has plots of land to plant urban gardens in and help people in that neighborhood grow food for their families. He said he just needs people to help him. So would you tell, when you're here painting this week or laying carpet, they're carpet squares, so you can do it. And when you're doing that, talk to him about his urban garden. I wrote a chapter, my latest book came out last fall, Barefoot Tribe, and I wrote a chapter just on gardens. And here's why I write about gardens. We started a community garden at the Grove because ecology matters to this next generation, and ecology matters to God. God began his work in a garden. We started a garden because we want to remind people that you can grow. God has put you here to produce something good with your life. We started a garden so families could cultivate land and turn the soil together to grow produce that would be on their own table at night. We started a garden to share. Every person or family that tends a plot is asked to share part of their harvest with a family that is struggling to get their feet on the ground or put food on their table. We started a garden to remind people that the earth is God's, and he wants us to use it wisely to meet our needs and the needs of the next generation. And so do you see why I say when you plant an urban farm or an urban garden, then the church becomes this messaging of God and hope to our city. I have another idea here for you, and this one is when you counsel a couple whose marriage is in trouble, the church, that's you, becomes a hope of this city. I don't know if you've known young couples, and sometimes it's older couples, it happens at all ages, but often young couples, their marriages get in trouble. They argue and they fight over the dumbest things. And they need godly men and women like you to step into their living rooms and start to tell them there's hope and that God can turn around their marriages. I've seen this in so many couples when a godly couple gets involved. When I say that, I think of this young couple Veronica and I knew in college, and soon after college, we got married, and then they got married, and then they started to argue a lot, like all of us do in our first year of marriage. And she got so mad one night that she packed her suitcase. Don't raise your hand, but have you ever threatened to do that? You're just trying to get your spouse's attention. It's a bad idea. Because for some reason, he just kept watching ESPN, so she left the house. I don't know what it was. And then she said she got in her car, and she's just crying, and she doesn't know where to go because they're in a new city, and she doesn't even have friends. So she drove around, and then she checked into a hotel. And then she was hungry, and she thought, maybe I'll feel better if I go get something to eat. So she went down to the restaurant and had the menu and started to order. And then she said a guy walked over and he said, "You look alone and lonely. Can I sit with you?" And she said he was so creepy and he was just a predator. And then he said something creepy like, "If I could redo the alphabet, I would put you next to I." And something, and that's even bad grammar. And so she said, "No, strange man, leave me, get away." And he left, and so she got out her phone and she called a friend. She said, "What do I do? I've got I'm so mad at my husband right now, but I've got strange men talking to me." And her friend, this godly friend, said, "Go home, go home. He knows what he was saying isn't right and fair. He'll say he's sorry. I know that. Go home." And so she grabbed her suitcase. She didn't even wait for her food. She just left and went back, and he apologized and started watching ESPN less, whatever it was. And their marriage is healed, and they've had all kinds of kids. They have a lot of kids. And they're doing great. But my point is that God needs you to speak into the life of couples who are struggling. Because when you do that, the church becomes the hope of the city. And maybe that story right now is your story. Maybe you've had a tough week or a really tough weekend with your husband or your wife. I want you to know that God can turn that around. Maybe you've been on the verge of walking out the door. Can I say turn around? Maybe you've thought about walking out on your family. Can I say turn around? That God can fix it. He's a redeeming God. All right, here's another thought, and I have a long list. If we can't get through them, we'll just quit. But this next one I have is when you do community art, the church becomes the hope of the city. It is. I love this story of some of our artists at the Grove who went, and they go to downtown Phoenix just to serve the homeless community. There, the homeless community hangs out in a place called The Zone. And some of our artists went there one night, and they just painted a big, huge, beautiful mural on the wall. Now, they serve there as well in other ways. But when you take the most blighted corner of a city and you make it beautiful, then in my opinion, you're spreading the beauty and the hope of God, then the church becomes the hope of the city. We have mothers here who heard that in some of our Chandler schools, they didn't have enough funding to do masterpiece art. And so they had cut the program from some of their curriculum. And so we had a group of moms here at the Grove come together, and they went and found principals and teachers. And they said, if you'll let us volunteer, some of us are teachers, some of us are artists, we can teach masterpiece art. And so the teachers and the principals said yes. And so they resurrected the program. They redeemed the program. And now you have low-income kids making art for their bedrooms and their refrigerators because of women at the Grove. And I just want to say, when you do community art in our schools or do art with kids in our schools, the church becomes the hope of the city. I'll say this next. When you mentor at-risk teens, the church becomes the hope of the city. When I say that, I think of Melissa. Melissa is here at the Grove, and Melissa doesn't work for a nonprofit. She hasn't started an organization, but she loves babies. She has her own babies and kids, but she loves especially single moms who have babies or young teenage moms who have babies. And when she hears of a single mom who has had a baby, or when she hears of a teenage mother who's had a baby, she finds them and she gets to know them. And she says, can I help you in any way? Is there anything you need? And of course, every single mom, every teenage mom needs things like cribs and baby clothes and what else do they need? Strollers and car seats and high chairs. And so Melissa gets on Facebook and Twitter and tells you, the people of the Grove, I need a high chair by dinner time tonight. And you guys respond. And everybody has baby clothes. You hold on to your kids' clothes, like they're in 9th grade and you still have their baby clothes because it's so there's some sentiment there. But Melissa needs it. So if you have a passion for single moms, and moms who are really young and you want to help them out, then find Melissa Westbrook, because when you mentor at-risk teens or young mothers, the church becomes the hope of this city. I'll say this next. When you tutor children of immigrants so they can assimilate and thrive in school, the church becomes the hope of the city. I think sometimes we forget that Jesus was often more for the foreigner than anyone else of his time. He was always talking about the stranger and the foreigner. He says in Matthew 25, I was a foreigner, but you invited me in. He says, that's how the gospel is spread. And so in our city, when we embrace the immigrant and let them know that we want them here instead of want them run out of here, it changes everything. And so Live Love, Melinda Gunther has started this program where men and women from the Grove come to our Live Love house, and we've been doing this for years and years in different places, and they tutor boys and girls. Usually, many of them are children of immigrants or of low-income families. And if Jesus was for the immigrant and the stranger, then so should you and me. I'll say this. When you invite neighbors into your living room to study the Bible, the church becomes the hope of the world. You heard Paul talk about life groups, and you've heard Scott Swanson say we're launching life groups this week. Sign up for a life group. Can I say to all of you who are hosting a life group in your home or teaching a life group, the life groups are not just for people from the Grove. Sometimes we think they are, and they're not. The life groups are also for your neighbors and your neighborhood. So if you're starting a life group this fall, then go find some neighbors that don't have a church home and invite them into your living room and study the Bible with them. About 11 years ago, Veronica and I moved into Creekwood Ranch. It's about 3 miles from here. And the first thing Veronica wanted to do was to start a Bible study for women. And so she told me what she was going to do, and I thought, that's pretty bold. She said, I'm going to walk through our neighborhood, and I'm going to invite every woman in Creekwood Ranch. And I said, that's crazy. So she went door to door, knocking on strangers' doors. And she did this until our living room was full of women. I was like, I'm going to buy you a bike and a white shirt and a black necktie because that's awesome, and we're going to just send you out more. And she's good at that. Not all Christians want to knock on strangers' doors. And the thing is, what I love about her story is the Bible study just didn't meet at our house, but it met at our neighbor's house across the street. And then one week they do it at another young woman's house, and it rotated around because the Bible study was for the neighborhood. The Bible study wasn't just for us or for the Grove. So I'll say this next. When you invite people into your neighborhood, into your living room to study the Bible, the church becomes the hope of the world. When you help an unemployed friend find a new job, the church becomes the hope of the city. Here's the thing. When you life coach a neighbor or a friend who's lost their job, or when a friend loses a job and you take them shopping for a new outfit. That'd be for the girls. I don't know if guys need new outfits, but women need buy outfits. But you help them get a haircut or get their hair done, whatever you do. Or you help them practice for their interview. And then you help them network and you start making phone calls for them. When you do that for a man or a woman who's lost their job, then the church becomes the hope of the city. Here, I have one last one. When you set up chairs in a parking lot in the worst part of town for people to gather to worship, the church becomes the hope of the city. Some of you, a year ago, we had Mingo visit from San Diego. Mingo lives in San Diego, and he started a movement. He hasn't started a church. He calls it a movement. It's called the Even Here movement. And what he does is he pulls together college students to go to parts of San Diego where there is no church, and then they set up chairs in the most absurd places you would never expect to have a church, like in a laundromat parking lot. And people go, you have church even here? And they go, yeah, even here, we're going to have church. And then they worship They invite the neighbors in the neighborhood. They set up chairs in front of a gym, and then the neighbors in the neighborhoods come and worship. They set up chairs in front of clubs that none of us should be going into, and then they invite the neighbors in the neighborhood to worship. They set up chairs in front of a body shop where you get your car fixed, and then they brought neighbors in the neighborhood to worship. And I just want to say, when you start worshiping like that everywhere in this city, then the church becomes the hope of the city. We have young men like Seth Wells that wants to start that here. Find Seth and tell him you'll start it with him, and tell him you'll help him out. Now, as I've been talking this morning, I've been thinking this, that 2,000 years ago, there's a kind of church. There's a kind of church that no one had seen before. There's this gathering of people. We read about it in Acts chapter 2. And they started to share what they had with each other and with the community. When we read about this gathering of people, all of their prejudices and biases melted away. Nobody was Greek and Jew anymore. They were all followers of Jesus Christ. And they began to live as one. And people began to hear about this community and this gathering of believers that we call the church. And it turned viral, and people wanted a part of it because it was not just good for the church. It was good for the city. It was good for families and communities and countries. And here's the thing, what happened 2,000 years ago can happen again, because the Spirit of God is not dead. The Spirit of God has not gone. He still is in people like you who God wants to send out into our city. And I just don't think it might happen again. I think what happened 2,000 years ago is happening again in this city, through this church, The Grove. And so if you've been on the fringe of this church, not sure if you should dive in, I want to say we need you, because together we're going to change this city. And maybe as you've been listening today and you hear me talk about Nineveh and how it needed to be redeemed, maybe you've been living in Nineveh. Maybe you know that. And you know that God needs to turn your life around. You know you've been at odds with His purposes and His plans for your life, and today is your day to turn around.